Hey, welcome back. So in this video, I thought I'd spend a little bit of time with ChatGPT. Now, I know there's a lot of buzz with that just now, but actually, as I've spent time with the tool and as I've spent time with other tools such as GitHub Copilot or even generative AI tools such as Stable Diffusion, I've realized that we're moving into this sort of new paradigm of computing. And I'm going to call that sort of the prompt-based programming. And I guess you could say it's more about generative AI, but I really think prompt-based programming is a good description of what I mean. So if you haven't seen ChatGPT before, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring it up. We're going to create some code. We'll play with some prompts, and then we'll look at something like Stable Diffusion, and then we'll talk about where I think the industry is going to go. So if you haven't got ChatGPT already, you can go to chat.openai.com/chat. You can sign up, etc. But if I open it up here, you can kind of see the screen in front of me, and it's a fairly simple interface. And I can just type in anything I want, and it gives you some examples like explain quantum computing in simple terms or whatever. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to start with some code examples, see how they look. And to be honest, some of them look pretty good, but I'll show you some of the limitations as we go along and we'll move it around. So the first thing I will do is I'm going to ask it to create an echo service in JavaScript. So all I'm going to do is type in something like create an express-based REST service that implements echo in JavaScript. So we're just going to type that, hit the prompt. Okay, so as you can see here, it's created that service. It's given some pretty good instructions how to get started. So here's an example of how you create an express-based REST service that implements an echo function in JavaScript. First thing I'm going to sort of say there is using the kind of require syntax, so it's not sort of leaned into using imports and stuff like that just now. It's using a const there. There's my echoes, accepting message as a parameter, and then it's returning that out. And and if you're a new programmer, I think that piece of code is going to be pretty useful to you. If you're a fairly experienced programmer, is that much use? You can knock up an Express server pretty quickly, but I think that's pretty good. Now, this is where it gets quite interesting. If I then decide, actually, I don't want that in JavaScript, I want that in TypeScript, I could ask it to just turn it into TypeScript. So all I need to do is say, build me the same service in TypeScript. So if I just type that in and then hit that, it's going to take, and this is one of the really cool things, is it understands the context. So it knows what this echo service is, and then it's going to give me that exact same echo service, but now it's going to do it in TypeScript. And you can see it's replaced that with import express from Express. Here's const express. It's the same code there, but what it's now doing is doing the TypeScript version. Now, we could probably argue about the code that it's generated. In all honesty, you'd be sitting there going, well, it's using implicit any's and it's not being explicit, blah, blah, blah. And we can get into that. But in the end of the day, it's kind of got kind of working code. So let me convert this back into JavaScript. Convert back to JavaScript. Okay, so I'm now back into my JavaScript version of this. And actually, you can get really cool if you want to. So let's say I want to say convert this to an ES5 compatible version of JavaScript. And here we go. So now what it's going to attempt to do is take this exact same echo function, but what it's going to do is try and convert this into something that's going to be ES5 compatible. And you can kind of see there, it's done a pretty good job of that, actually. So the first thing that it's done here is it said, okay, in order to be ES5 compatible, I'm going to convert this to a function. So that's pretty good rather than using arrow functions. And then what it's also going to do is it's not using the const, but it's using the var. So actually, it's came back with that pretty good. Now, actually, I'm going to show you something that I did earlier. So if I come back onto my previous screen, this is really interesting. Okay, so it did a pretty good job there, but one of the things I want you to see is that I actually tried this a little bit earlier. Rather than trying to do the ES5 compatible, I tried to make it ES4 compatible. So what actually happened in that case is that here's an example of an echo service written in JavaScript, ES4 compatible, using Express Web Framework. And it sort of came back and it went const express, and it did the function conversion. So rather than use an arrow function, converted it to function like we did before. But it kind of got the const wrong. So it should have reverted back to being a var, but in that case, it stuck with a const. Now this is the really cool thing, right? Now it didn't make that mistake when we ran this test live here, but what I actually typed in is const was not available in ES4, right? And then it went, you are correct. The const keyword was not available in ECMAScript 4 and older versions of JavaScript. In those versions, you would use the var keyword to declare variables instead. Here is an example of the echo service written in ES4 compatible JavaScript using the var keyword instead of const. So what it then did is it gave me a new version of this, but it got rid of the const and then converted that to a var. What's really cool is that obviously in this version of the video, what I was going to do is replay that scenario, but it kind of seems to have learned from its mistakes in that time frame. So, but you know, I kept the transcript from earlier, and you can see it's done that. What I'm getting at here, though, is, I mean, it's pretty cool stuff, right? I can sit and just change my code as I go along. It's understanding the context, and I'm able to make changes as I go along. And if I wanted, I could just add new stuff in there. So I could say add an endpoint which returns the current time onto the same echo service. So if I just add that in for a second, it should just then add another function onto this time service. So here we go. Here's my Express service. It's creating my app as well. That's all fine. Now, what's probably interesting in this case is kind of lost a little bit of the context. So it's sort of ignoring the kind of ES5 version of this, and it's gone back to sort of being ES6 compatible, right? So it's you could argue that, you know, and it's also ignored the TypeScript version, so it's lost a little bit of context, but you know, but it's able to take the context of I want an echo service, and now I want a time service, and it's going to return that. But again, I mean, if I want to, I could just tell it to convert it back to TypeScript. So convert this to TypeScript. And then, of course, I'm going to get the TypeScript version of that again. So this context sensitivity is sort of really good. But one of the things, and the point of this video is we were talking about prompt-based programming, is what you're starting to see is that when I write code, then what I want to be able to do is start writing little prompts and little keywords, etc., to then start getting the right context that I want. I want a REST-based service. I want you to use Express. I'm saying use TypeScript. I'm saying use ES4 compatible or ES5 compatible, right? So I'm starting to use these prompts to shape the results that I want. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you some of the same concepts, but what we're going to do is we're going to use Stable Diffusion. So rather than using Stable Diffusion itself, and it's going to take ages to generate that, I'm going to very quickly jump into Dream Studio, which uses Stable Diffusion underneath there, and it's going to generate things a little bit quickly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just create a very simple picture. So maybe I'm going to write something like a laptop computer. And we'll just hit Dream, and we should see some laptops. There we go, some fairly basic laptops. And then what we could then say, made by Pablo Picasso. So let's see what that looks like. And there we go. So if Pablo Picasso wanted to create laptops, you could have that. And maybe we would then say something like, maybe we change that and we say, no, actually I want fantasy art. And now you've got some sort of fantasy arts type laptops, but you get my point that I'm sort of coming from, which is what we are starting to do is taking these known prompts. So we've started with something with a base, and then we're sort of changing that. So if I come back to the example that we showed earlier with ChatGPT, then what we started with is we started with an echo function, and then we added, we converted it to TypeScript, you know. But if I said at the beginning, so I said in JavaScript, but if I said create an Express-based REST service that implements echo, and then I say TypeScript, and also add an endpoint that returns time. So if I click that, so now you can see what I've done is sort of combine some of the earlier prompts, put in the prompts that I want, the sort of keywords like use TypeScript, use JavaScript, do an echo function, do a time function, and then I've generated what I want. What I'm doing is shaping it with prompts in the same way as I was shaping things with Stable Diffusion. So you sort of get the idea that what's going to start to happen in time in the same way as with generative AI art. I think the same things are going to apply to generative AI code, right? We'll start using prompts like use TypeScript, use a REST API, use a GraphQL API. In fact, I could probably convert this to GraphQL. So convert the previous service, convert the service to GraphQL API written with Apollo server. So if I run that, I'm sure it's going to convert the same thing into GraphQL. And there you go. So it's written an Apollo server code, and it's basically converted everything into the format that I want. So it's pretty good, right? And this is what I was saying about prompts. I want this as GraphQL. I want this as REST. I want this as TypeScript, right? I want an echo service. I want a time service. And it's going to figure that out for us and take the context. And if we start getting the prompts right, it's going to generate the right code. And then I think what we're going to end up start doing is we will probably start writing our code in such a way so that we can start to use generative prompts sort of going forward. But I mean, you can get I mean, it's absolutely fabulous. I mean, if you look at this, it's utterly breathtaking. But if you look at this, I mean, look at the code that it's generated. It's created an Apollo server. It's created my GraphQL schema there. With my types for echo and time. It's recognized that it's a query rather than a mutation. It's returning a date2 string. It's joining together my type diffs and my resolvers, and it's generating it. So it's taken that whole function and converted that into a GraphQL service. So let me. So that's probably one of the second things that I think is going to start to become important as we go forward in this prompt-based programming, is that when you don't understand how to create something, what you could do is then create it in a method you do understand. So if you know how to create something as a REST API, start to shape it as a REST API, and then use the code to generate it back as a GraphQL API. But actually, it's not the only thing that you could do. So one of the things that we could do is we could actually convert this to a completely different language. So let's take the example that I've got. I'm going to retake this prompt that we have, which is create an Express-based API that implements echo. So we'll just put that back so that we have a REST service again. So that will generate the same code that we had before. And now what I'm going to say is take that service and I want you to convert it into Python, and I want you to use the Fast API framework. So convert the service to Python using the Fast API framework. So let's just run it. So I'm not a very good Python programmer. I don't know Fast API very well, but let's see what it comes up with. And here we go. Here's an example of how you create a Fast API app that implements an echo function and a time endpoint in Python. So from Fast API import Fast API app equals Fast API. There it's using a decorator for echo message. Here's an asynchronous echo function. Message of type string, return the message, and here's my time function, returning a date time there. Now, I'm going to be honest, I mean, I would have to put that into Python to know if that works, because my Python is terrible, but it kind of feels as if it's okay, so I think that's pretty good. But that opens probably the second scenario that I'm going to see with sort of generative AI code, is that the ability to be polyglot with languages is great now. So I think even if you don't know a language very, very well, what you could do is write something in a language you understand, or shape the code in the way that you understand in a language you like, and then be able to bring it into a more appropriate language. And that could be a really interesting piece. So it's almost like, people, we talk about the language scenarios with AI, where the universal translator for, English to French or French to German or whatever, well, actually, and everybody can speak and talk their own languages or write their own languages, and then it gets converted to the kind of real human languages real time. Well, actually, we can start to do the same for code languages as well. You've just seen us convert that to the Python version. So I can write in a language that I'm comfortable and then put it in another language. Why would that be advantageous? Because actually, if you think about something like a Rust, where maybe you haven't learned a Rust language, then for you to be able to take that language, if you're a JavaScript or TypeScript developer, write it in a language that you're familiar with, but then be able to convert it into a language that's maybe faster, got more performance like a Rust, and then you get the advantages of that. But actually, I think that opens us up into a wider conversation for compilers, and back to this idea of prompt-based programming, is that as generative code languages get better and better, and I don't think they're there just now, then it's maybe one abstraction up. So if we think of the abstractions that we've had in programming to date, we started with kind of ones and zeros, hexadecimal type things. We moved up into assembly as the abstraction layer, and then as time has went by, then you've seen languages like C, and they were considered as high level programming language at the time, but really we consider them as a low level programming languages. So C was then the abstraction above assembly. C and assembly is very, very close. And again, you've seen that with other languages as well, like Forth or whatever, where you see a lot of closeness between the assembly language and the language above, and then the compilers converted that down. But even modern days, we're now in we moved up to kind of your Pythons and JavaScripts, etc. And then if I go even one level above there, you think of JavaScript, well, TypeScript is a level above, right? Because TypeScript's transpiling down into JavaScript, etc. And we see this with WebAssembly, where you write in various languages, compiles down into WebAssembly, and then again, down again. And I wonder that now that we're in this sort of generative AI era, are we going to start to code in prompts? And again, and if you're thinking we're not going to do that, then again, look at the Stable Diffusion examples where we can generate art using prompts. So I think that's a really interesting paradigm that we're sort of going to move into, where the prompts start to become more important. And that means as we start to look at our code, we have to start marking up our code in a way that it can be consumed by AI or not consumed by AI, because not all code should be consumed by AI or be learned from. You've got to respect different license types. And I know things like GitHub Copilot, etc., don't necessarily respect all the license types that you have today. So again, we're going to, in the same way GitHub Copilot's causing controversy there, there's a whole level of new licensing that needs to be figured out on what can be learned and what cannot be learned and what is truly original and what's not. But I think one of the things that's going to be sure that's going to happen in forward is that we are going to be able to we are going to start writing our code and documentation to help the AI, and we're going to start tagging things properly. Because actually, if you look at things like AI and images, think of all the tagging associated with images. This is this so it can learn. But the same is going to happen with our code as well, because we want that sort of intention. So I think that's a really interesting way forward and a really interesting thing that's going to happen. And that's why I believe we're going to start to end up in this sort of prompt-based programming. That does mean that things like the right language for the right tool at the right time is going to become important. So if you're doing something machine learning, it makes more sense to lean into Python perhaps, or if you're doing something that's back-end web service and you want performance, then you can pick the right framework and tool, and I think that sort of makes sense as well. So this ability to mix and match will really happen over time. Again, we're very early at this stage, but you kind of see that happen. Now, what I would say is, if I start thinking about this even further, there is kind of dangers here as well. Because as great as that is, that I said, go convert this into a Python app, the knowledge base here is 2021. And you can see it's kind of biased. I prompted it towards fast API. But let's see what happens if I say, turn this into a Rust. Convert this to a Rust program. So let's see what happens here for a second. So it's going to say, here's an example how you create a Rust program that implements echo function at a time endpoint using the Rocket Web framework. Now, that's kind of interesting because I don't know why it's picked Rocket. Do you know what I mean? modern day, if I was honest, modern day Rust programmers, most people are kind of leaning into using something like Axum, for example. And I think this is probably something that becomes sort of really interesting in this space. In this particular case, the AI is is learned as far as sort of 2021. What I would say here is that the Rust framework has moved so fast, right? That the frameworks and tools that you would use at the end of 2021 is very different from what you would be using sort of 2022. So I would sort of expect it to lean into Axum. And therefore, that becomes an interesting point as well of we talk about AI bias, but then there becomes a kind of framework bias as well, because as these tools are using more and more over again, there's going to be more examples with the same frameworks being overused again, and therefore the AI is going to start using the frameworks that it knows, and therefore that's going to start to become the sort of dominant framework. So there's going to be a lot of bias built into that. So it opens up a whole question on the AI is how do you start to measure what you want to be used in these prompts? Do you want something to be better performance? Do you want it to be use this framework? Do you want to use that? But again, there's still a level of skill and knowledge for you to generate the right piece of code, and I don't think that's going to change in the next 6 months or so, but that's going to change over time. Now, where I think we're going to get to an interesting scenario in the future is, of course, as we write more of this code and we get more prompt-like, etc., and we start tuning our boundaries as we go forward, then we're going to use AI to write more and more code, and that's going to therefore and the feedback cycle is going to be quicker as well. So there's going to kind of come a point where we are probably not going to be able to catch up with the frameworks, and therefore the AI and the tools are going to be ahead of us. And I would say even this example today gives you an idea, right? Which is even at the end of 2021, if you think of something like Rust, the ecosystem has moved on so much in the last 9 months that the AI in this case has not caught up. How do you expect real human beings who are using this every day to catch up? And therefore, of course, the AI will catch up, but then how can the humans catch up, right? Because there's so much stuff to learn, and we're going to start depending on the prompts, and therefore the frameworks are going to get abstracted below as well, and we're going to be less concerned about the frameworks, and more of the frameworks are going to become AI generated, and we're going to end up in this scenario, the same scenario that you have with things like chess today, where we don't understand some of the underlying frameworks, and a lot of the frameworks will be generated by code, and therefore we're going to start having that AI generated code. So the sort of AI code generation era is started. This prompt-based programming era is started. We will be programming with prompts more and more over the next few years, and then there'll come a point where AI is going to generate a lot more of the code for us, and that's going to be abstracted away from us. So we're moving into a really interesting time, I think. I honestly think looking at something like Stable Diffusion and seeing how AI generated art moves on will really be interesting to our industry as well, because that's going to understand where we're going. Now, the next thing that I would say is there's a lot of artists at the moment that are really freaking out because they're saying that, well, we're depriving somebody of a job, right? So if you're using AI generated art, then somebody else would have been created that. There's a lot of argument back the way. I mean, I wouldn't be personally as a just a straight developer writing some code for YouTube or whatever. I wouldn't be paying somebody to generate art for me, because I can't really afford to do that, and I don't think most people can. Whereas I can use AI generated art to generate my code. And now I would like it to be that we're not infringing copyright or any of that sort of thing, and I think that's really important. And the industry will figure that out in the same ways it has to figure it out with code. But AI generated art is here to stay, and there's going to be AI generated artists, and we're therefore going to have AI generated coders. And as actually this is going to make coding more accessible to regular people, right? People who are not developers by trade, right? Which is in the same way, it's not accessible for me to generate art because I can't afford to pay somebody to pay for art, and I certainly can't draw any art because I haven't got any talent in that shape, but I can write prompts and I can generate sort of what I'm looking for. There's going to be a lot of people in the same space with code, right? Where before you would have had a developer or they wouldn't have done that. And now what you're going to start to see, I believe, over the next few years is you're going to see these citizen coders. It's not going to be like low code in that sense, but they're going to start to maybe a next generation of low code where you're going to then start taking the tools and generating the code that you need. Using AI generation as it gets more powerful. So I think that's really interesting. I think we're probably a long way off before we're generating these massive complicated programs, but as you saw today, actually some of that's pretty good already. But then the examples I've used are kind of fairly simple. But then our industry is about simple examples as well. So one of the things that I would expect to see over time is that things like functional programming is going to become more important, and microservices, etc., because actually we should be about creating smaller programs. We should be about standardizing things. So in the same way as we standardize cables and industry and all that, we're going to start to standardize how we describe functions. This is a Fibonacci. This is a save a customer record to MongoDB. We'll start to standardize how we define records, etc., because that's going to be really important to be able to have the AI generate the right things in different languages. So I see that world coming as well, but it does mean that we're going to want to get smaller and more composable, which is the direction we're going as an industry as a whole anyway. So I think it's really exciting. So functional programmers, your time has come, because we're going to be doing lots of composition, but that's going to enable this citizen developer and a lot of people actually generating companies, generating new tools, using AI who are not natural programmers, but being able to put that together. And that might be a scary future, but I actually think it's really exciting. And then I can see architecture changing. So I'm super excited about this. Last thing I want to do is, just before we finish, is we created a service there. I mean, the nice thing about the context is then I can say, generate a React app that calls the previously generated service. So let's just do that. So not only can it generate my server apps, but what you will find is it can actually give you instructions on how to create the actual underlying React app, which will generate the UI. So as you can see here, it's generating that out. It doesn't get everything right all the time. And again, as I said, its knowledge is really back to sort of 2021. There's bias in the tools that it uses. But as I said, I think this concept of prompt-based programming and us starting to align on industry terms and industry prompts in the same ways you're already seeing in AI-generated art, because they start to use terms like hyper-realistic, they use different texture types, etc. They use different colors, etc. And all of these things, when terms like fantasy art, Picasso, hyper-realistic, and as you combine those terms together, then it shapes the response, and then use negative responses, etc. We're going to see the same thing in sort of coding AI code. And then what you're going to do is we're going to be in this new paradigm of programming code. So anyway, as you can kind of see here, it started creating that React app, which is using a fetch in this case, but you can see what it's doing there. It's calling localhost 3000. It's calling my echo service, passing in a message. So it understands the service that it needs to create, and it understands the client app that it needs to do, and then do that and shape that. It's pretty outstanding stuff. So anyway, I think we are moving into this new paradigm of AI generative code. I think we're moving into this paradigm a lot quicker than we were expecting. But I do believe this idea of prompt-based programming is gonna, in the same way as we see this with art such as Stable Diffusion, I think that's kind of a new paradigm that we can look forward to. But anyway, the industry is going to be pretty interesting. As you see, there's my React app generated for me, server side, code side. And again, this is just very early at the moment, but as that starts to integrate into tools like VS Code in the same way as GitHub Copilot is, as we start to putting these prompts into our code to make it easier to learn, we're going to be in this really interesting world very, very quickly. Anyway, I think the future is kind of exciting. It's a little scary, but it's kind of good scary, but it's exciting. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll catch you soon on the next one.